You may be seated. Get thee behind me, Satan. I love that line. I find it especially helpful when the dessert cart gets rolled around at the restaurant. Well, that's not an issue of salvation, thank God. But this issue that Peter sets before Jesus is, in fact, an issue of salvation. Peter wants Jesus to take a different path, to bypass the cross. He tells Jesus that his death must not happen. We've heard a lot about Peter these last several weeks in our gospel readings as we work our way through Matthew. And the more Matthew reveals about Peter, the more I appreciate the fact that only the Son of God could put up with him. Peter is impulsive. Sometimes he believes. Sometimes he doubts Jesus. Just last Sunday, we heard the passage which tells of Peter correctly identifying Jesus as the Messiah. And Jesus tells Peter, you are the rock, the solid foundation on which Christian belief will be spread. Good job, Peter, you got one right. But in today's story, Jesus calls Peter Satan and admonishes him to get out of the way of the will of God. Poor Peter. He is truly and utterly and completely human. And Jesus chose him just as he chooses us. In today's gospel story, Jesus is trying to prepare his disciples for what is going to happen to him. Jesus wants them to embrace the necessity of his death because of what will come next. But Jesus hasn't really given the disciples any details about what it means that on the third day he will be raised. We know what that means because we have the benefit of living after the fact. But the disciples would have had no concept that Jesus would return in an even more powerful presence. Of course, Peter wants to resist. He thinks the death of Christ will be his end because he doesn't understand that in the resurrection, Christ will be the end of death. So I don't think Peter is trying to be obstructive in this passage when he wants to deter Jesus from giving in to the opposition. I think Peter's voicing his human instinct to protect Jesus and himself from the suffering that Jesus is predicting. Peter is fully human, and as such, he represents all our desires to bypass suffering whenever we can. The Buddhists say suffering is an inherent part of life. Jesus says we must take up our cross. Judaism considers suffering a part of the human experience. All three look at suffering not as punishment from God, but as opportunities, not as something we are expected to welcome, but also not without the potential for redemption. In Christianity and Judaism, suffering is an invitation to draw closer to God. Richard Rohr, a Franciscan priest, contemporary mystic, and a favorite theologian of mine, teaches that our greatest moments of growth and faith come through times of great love and great suffering. As we deal with the most difficult, tragic, and painful things life throws at us, redemption is possible. Often we're not able to see that possibility when we are in the midst of despair. But at some point, the question comes to mind, How, in the midst of this suffering, do I want to respond? The answer to that question will shape one's spiritual journey for a lifetime. In the readings we heard today, there are two lines which have always challenged my understanding. I am who I am comes from the Hebrew Scriptures, and take up your cross from the Gospels. I don't know why these have always made me question if I was grasping their meaning, and I hope it's okay to admit that I've struggled with them because they are pretty fundamental texts. But as I studied these readings in combination, they came together for me in a new and different way, one supporting the other. Now, as I have told you before, my default is to just see the literal meaning in a text. And this is not especially helpful when studying the Bible. In fact, I do not recommend it at all. So if I had been writing what God said to Moses from the burning bush, I would have put it in very different language. Instead of, I am who I am, which I find vague and enigmatic, I would have said something like, Moses, tell the Israelites, I am eternal, unchanging, transcendent, incomprehensible, and the only judge of truth. It's not nearly as poetic as I am who I am, but it is what that phrase is trying to impart. What I hear God saying from that bush is that freedom from oppression is going to be hard, but I am will be there to see God's people through this journey called life. Now let's put that together with what Jesus tells the disciples. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. If we take that statement by itself and literally, as I am wont to do, it sounds like an invitation to martyrdom, and that is not what Jesus is saying. The message is not that we must seek out suffering in order to be good Christians. But if we want to be good Christians, suffering is inevitable. Because following Christ means giving of ourselves to others. Suffering is also inevitable because life is hard. And that's where I am who I am becomes our strength and makes us resilient in the face of the sacrifices we choose and the sufferings we are handed. Now, there's more to what happened at the crucifixion than is revealed in the written account of Jesus' murder. The facts, as we know them, only tell part of the story. There's more to be learned by considering how Jesus accepted his fate. How was he able to resist the temptation Peter put before him to avoid the cross? Even though Jesus wavered in the garden and asked God to spare him from his mission, Jesus never lost absolute conviction that I am stood on the other side of that cross. And that is the good news on this Sunday. Our God, who calls us to walk through this life accepting the suffering that is inevitable, to take up our cross and step into the pain of sacrificing for others. That God is eternal, unchanging, transcendent, incomprehensible, and the only judge of truth. I am who I am stands in, beside, behind, and through every cross we bear. And for that, Let us give thanks to God.